Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 118. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're reading the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter, and each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 118, the top 3 issues are the identity of those who fear the Lord in verse 4, the stone of verse 22, and the meaning of verse 27, which either talks about a sacrifice bound with cords or a kind of dance that involves tree branches. The first top exegetical issue in Psalm 118 is the identity of those who fear the Lord in verse 4. The first 4 verses of Psalm 118 mention 3 groups of people. Verse 2 mentions Israel, verse 3 mentions the house of Aaron, and verse 4 mentions those who fear the Lord, Hebrew, Yir'eh Adonai. The identity of the first 2 groups is pretty clear. The house of Aaron in verse 3 refers to the priests, and Israel in verse 2 probably refers to the Israelite laity, that is, all of the Israelites present at this festival who were not priests. The identity of the third group, however, is less clear. 2 main options have been proposed for understanding the identity of those who fear the Lord in Psalm 118. The first option is that Yir'eh Adonai is a technical term referring to Gentile proselytes, that is, Gentiles who've become more or less integrated into Israel. The other option is that the phrase Yir'eh Adonai refers to all of Israel, both priests and laity, and so the third group is really just the combination of the first 2 groups. It seems likely that Gentile proselytes would have been present at this festival at which Psalm 118 was recited. Several passages in the Old Testament mention sojourners joining in the celebration of Israelite feast days. Exodus 12, for example, says that if a stranger shall sojourn with you and would keep the Passover to the Lord, let all his males be circumcised. Then he may come near and keep it. He shall be as a native of the land. And other passages mention sojourners participating in the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Booths. It's also clear that at some point in Jewish history, the phrase, those who fear the Lord, came to refer to Gentile proselytes in particular. The phrase is often used in this way, for example, in the Midrashic literature. We see it in the New Testament as well. In Acts, for example, the Gentile Cornelius is described as someone who fears God. In Acts 13, Paul goes to a synagogue and he begins his sermon by addressing both Israelites and Gentiles who worship God. The phrase which the NIV translates as Gentiles who worship God is literally those who fear God. And so Paul groups his audience into 2 main categories, Jews and Gentile proselytes. It could be that we have a similar distinction in Psalm 118. Verse 2 addresses the Israelite laity, verse 3 addresses the Israelite priesthood, and verse 4 addresses Gentiles who have come to fear the Lord. But although there's evidence that the phrase Yir'eh Adonai eventually came to function as a technical term for Gentile proselytes, there's no clear evidence that the phrase functioned this way in the Old Testament. By contrast, there are places in the Old Testament where the phrase seems to refer to not Gentiles, but Israelites. Psalm 115, for example, says, O Israel, trust in the Lord, He is their help and their shield. O house of Aaron, trust in the Lord, He is their help and their shield. You who fear the Lord, trust in the Lord, He is their help and their shield. The Lord has remembered us, He will bless us, He will bless the house of Israel, He will bless the house of Aaron, He will bless those who fear the Lord, both the small and the great. In this passage, we see the same 3 groups as in Psalm 118, Israel, the house of Aaron, and those who fear the Lord. Notice that in Psalm 115, those who fear the Lord, the phrase is in apposition to both the small and the great, a phrase which might refer to Israelites who were priests, the great, and Israelites who were not priests, the small. In any case, it's more likely that the small and the great would apply to Israel as a whole than to the more narrow group of Gentile proselytes, especially when we consider that the wider context of Psalm 115 is about Israel's devoted worship of the Lord in contrast to the nation's worship of their idols. In a context like this, in Psalm 115, the phrase, those who fear the Lord, more likely refers to the entire people of God, which would have included Gentile proselytes, but would not have been limited to them. And it makes sense that all Israel should be referred to as those who fear the Lord, because this is exactly what all of Israel was supposed to do. Fearing the Lord was a foundational expectation of Israel in the context of their covenant relationship with the Lord. As Deuteronomy 10:12 says, "And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you, but to fear the Lord your God?" In conclusion, then, we've interpreted the phrase Yir'eh Adonai as a reference not to Gentile proselytes in particular, but to all Israelites, both laity and priesthood. In the end, whether a priest or a lay person, whether small or great, the most important thing about every Israelite at this festival, the thing which unites them all, is their fear of the Lord. And so the whole congregation is described as those who fear the Lord. If asked to rate our level of confidence we have in our interpretation of this verse on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation an A rating. The next issue for Psalm 118 is the stone of verse 22. The verse says that the stone that the builders rejected has become the blank. The Hebrew phrase here is Rosh Pinah. The basic meaning of the word Rosh is head, and the basic meaning of the word Pinah is corner. And so the phrase says something like head of a corner. The stone that the builders rejected has become the head of a corner. But what exactly this refers to is the subject of a lot of debate. It's interesting to compare, for example, two versions of the NIV translation. The 1984 version translates Rosh Pinah as capstone, that is, a stone or a bunch of stones that would have gone on top of a building. The 2011 NIV, however, translates Rosh Pinah as cornerstone. That is a stone which goes at the bottom of a building, the first stone to be laid in its construction, to which all the other stones are then oriented. The exact phrase Rosh Pinah never occurs anywhere else in the Bible, though similar phrases do occur. In Job 38, for example, the Lord says to Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? Even Pinatah." Although this passage doesn't use the phrase Rosh Pinah, it does use the phrase Even Pinah, a stone of a corner, and here the phrase clearly refers to a cornerstone. Similarly, in a passage in Jeremiah, the Lord says to Babylon, "No stone shall be taken from you for a corner, Even Lefinah, and no stone for a foundation, but you shall be a perpetual waste." In other words, Babylon is going to be destroyed, and she will never be rebuilt. None of her torn down stones will be used for a corner, lefinah. That is, none of her stones will become cornerstones for any new structures. This interpretation of Rosh Pinah as cornerstone might also find some support in the New Testament. In Ephesians chapter 2, Paul refers to the church as a building, with the apostles as its foundation and the Messiah as the cornerstone. In Greek, the akrogonieios. This same word, akrogonieios, is the word that the ancient Greek translator Symmachus used to translate Rosh Pinah in Psalm 118. So it could be that Paul is thinking of Psalm 118 when he describes Jesus as the akrogonieios, and it could be that Paul would have understood the Rosh Pinah in Psalm 118 to refer to a cornerstone. But there are some problems with the arguments that are used to support the cornerstone interpretation in Psalm 118. In the first place, it isn't so clear that akrogonieios in Ephesians refers to a cornerstone. There's a passage in the Testament of Solomon, a Christian text probably from around the 1st century, and it says, "So Jerusalem was being built, and the temple was moving toward completion. Now there was a gigantic akrogonieios, which I wished to place at the head of the corner to complete the temple of God. All the artisans and all the demons who were helping came to the same location to bring the stone and mount it at the end of the temple, but they were not strong enough to budge it." In this passage, the akrogonieios refers to a stone that goes on top of the structure at the end of the construction process, and not to a cornerstone, which is placed at the beginning of the construction process. Interestingly, this passage in the Testament of Solomon also alludes specifically to Psalm 118:22 by using the phrase head of the corner, which is how the Septuagint translates Rosh Pinah. The author of the Testament of Solomon seems to have understood Rosh Pinah, or at least its Greek equivalent, not as a cornerstone, but as the top of the corner of the temple. The Hebrew evidence cited to support interpreting Rosh Pinah as cornerstone is also problematic. The passages cited earlier, the Job passage, the Jeremiah passage, the Isaiah passage, refer to an even pina or to an even lefina, but none of these passages use the word rosh. If Psalm 118:22 said only that the stone which the builders rejected has become the corner, lefina, then the reference would clearly be to a cornerstone. But instead, the text says that the stone the builders rejected has become the rosh pina, the head of the corner, or the top of the corner. Some have tried to argue that rosh here means chief or best, the best cornerstone. But it seems odd to refer to a best cornerstone or a chief cornerstone when a building has only one cornerstone. And so the cornerstone view has trouble explaining the presence of the word rosh. The other option then is to interpret rosh pina not as a cornerstone but as the top of the corner of a structure, similar to how the Testament of Solomon interpreted it. The word pina often refers to the corner of a structure, for example, the corner of a wall or the corner of a house. And the word rosh often refers to the top of something, for example, the top of a mountain or the top of a tower. Reading rosh pina then as the top of the corner of some structure has the advantage of interpreting each word in the phrase according to a common and well-attested meaning. And unlike the cornerstone interpretation, this interpretation accounts for the word rosh. This interpretation of the phrase also fits well in the context of the verse. Verse 22 is talking about a stone that has been rejected by the builders, but then is used in the end for a prominent position, the top of the corner. The logic seems to presuppose that the stone was rejected at the beginning of the construction process, but used at the end of the construction process as a stone on the very top in a prominent position now for all to see. In conclusion, then, we interpret the phrase rosh pina to refer to the top of a corner. The stone that the builders rejected has become the top of the corner, and we give this interpretation a B rating. The third issue in Psalm 118 is in verse 27. We've translated the second half of this verse as, "Bind the festival sacrifice with cords up to the horns of the altar." Our translation here is pretty close to what a number of other translations have. The ESV, for example, says, "Bind the festal sacrifice with cords up to the horns of the altar." Other translations, however, have something different. The NRSV, for example, says, "Bind the festal procession with branches up to the horns of the altar." So note that where the ESV has festal sacrifice, the NRSV has festal procession. And where the ESV has cords, the NRSV has branches. The Hebrew text reads, "Isru chag ba'avotim ad karnot hamizbeach." The differences in translation have to do with the interpretation of two Hebrew words, the word chag, either sacrifice or procession, and the word avotim, either cords or branches. According to the ESV and others, the word chag, which normally refers to a festival gathering or a feast, here refers metonymically to a festival sacrifice. The word seems to have this meaning, for example, in Exodus 23, "The fat of my festival offerings, chagi, must not be kept until morning." But according to the NRSV and others, the word chag refers metonymically not to a festival sacrifice, but to a festival procession, that is, a kind of dance leading up to the horns of the altar. Although chag never clearly refers to a procession anywhere else, the root chagag is associated with festival dancing. For example, in Psalm 42, the psalmist says, "I walked among the crowds of worshippers, leading a great procession to the house of God, singing for joy and giving thanks amid the sound of a great celebration. B'kol rinav todah hamon chogeg." The meaning of the word chag in Psalm 118 is closely related to the meaning of the following word, avotim. If chag refers to a sacrifice, then avotim probably refers to cords or ropes, which is what this word usually means. In Psalm 2, for example, we read, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords, avotemo, from us." If, however, chag refers to a dance or a procession, then avotim probably doesn't refer to cords. Rather, if chag refers to a procession, then avotim is probably a different word that refers to branches. We see this word, for example, probably in Ezekiel's description of a tree in chapter 19. Its strong stems became rulers' scepters. It towered aloft among the thick boughs of avotim. It was seen in its height with the mass of its branches. There's a passage in Leviticus where the same word avot is used in connection to the feast of Sukkot. Leviticus 23:40 says, "On the first day you are to take branches from luxuriant trees, from palms, willows, and other leafy trees, eitz avot, and rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days." It's perhaps not surprising then that Psalm 118:27, which mentions both a festival, chag, and branches, or at least a word that could be interpreted to mean branches, avotim, is associated in Jewish tradition with the feast of Sukkot. There's a passage in the Mishnah, for example, that talks about dancing around the altar with branches and connects this practice to Psalm 118. It says, "What was the rite of the willow branch? Well, there was a place below Jerusalem called Motzah. They went down there and collected young willow branches, and they came up and set them upright along the sides of the altar with their tops bent over the top of the altar. Each day they walked in procession once around the altar and say," quoting from Psalm 118, "Please, Lord, grant salvation. Please, Lord, grant success." We see a similar association of Psalm 118 and branches in the New Testament. As John tells the story, the next day the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, again quoting Psalm 118, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel." And so there seems to be an ancient tradition of seeing in Psalm 118:27 a festal procession with branches around the altar. It's unlikely, however, that this old interpretation reflects the earliest understanding of the verse. The main difficulty with this interpretation, and the reason why it's probably a secondary development, is the verb asar, translated here as bind. This verb occurs some 70 times in the Bible, and it never clearly refers to binding a dance or a procession or anything like that. By contrast, the verb does refer to the binding of animals. 1 Samuel 6:7, for example, says, "Now then, get a cart ready with 2 cows that have calved and have never been yoked. Hitch the cows to the cart," using the verb asar. The verb also occurs in close connection with the noun cords, avotim. For example, Samson says to Delilah, "If they bind me with new ropes, asur ya'asruni ba'avotim, new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak and be like anyone else." The use of the verb asar, then, supports reading avotim as cords or ropes, and it supports reading chag as a sacrificial animal. By contrast, it's difficult to see how the verb asar fits if we understand chag as a dance or a procession. This interpretation, too, is reflected in an old Jewish tradition. The Targum of Psalms translates the second half of Psalm 118:27, "Bind the lamb for the sacrifice of the festival with chains until you offer it and sprinkle its blood on the horns of the altar." In conclusion, then, we've understood this verse to refer not to a procession with branches, but to the binding of a sacrifice with cords. We give this interpretation a B rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. The psalm seems to be said in the context of a big festival, one of Israel's feast days. We might imagine that at this feast, the chorus leader opens in verse 1 with an initial call to praise. "Give thanks to the Lord because he is good, because his loyalty is forever." Then he turns to the crowd of the Israelite laity assembled and he calls out to them, "Let Israel say," and then the crowd responds, "Because his loyalty is forever." Then he turns to the crowd of priests and he calls out, "Let the house of Aaron say," and they respond, "Because his loyalty is forever." And then the chorus leader draws all who are present together as one big group, and he reminds them of their true identity as those who fear the Lord. "Let those who fear the Lord say, because his loyalty is forever." In the rest of the psalm, a leader of Israel, probably the king, describes in this festival how he fought against enemies and struggled against death itself. Although he was pushed down, he says, in the end he was exalted by the Lord's right hand. Verse 22 then applies a kind of proverbial statement to the king's situation. The stone that the builders rejected has become the top of the corner. That is, the king was rejected. He was pushed down. He was low. He was at the brink of death, but then the Lord rescued him and exalted him. He was like a stone which the builders had rejected at the beginning of the construction process, but which by the end of the construction process has become exalted to the highest position, to the top of the corner for all to see. Finally, the climax of the festival comes in verse 27 with the festival sacrifice. The people bind the sacrifice with cords up to the horns of the altar and offer it as a thanksgiving sacrifice to the Lord. Then in verse 28, the king expresses his thanks to God, and in verse 29, the people express their thanks to God, and the poem ends just like it began. Give thanks to the Lord because he is good, because his loyalty is forever. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 118, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our Poetic Features video explores the natively Hebrew poetic nature of the psalm. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at cdbr.org to learn more.